The apartment felt quieter than it ever had, though nothing inside it had changed. The photographs on the living room wall were still there. The soft toys still lined the shelves in the nursery, and the tiny pink shoes still sat neatly beside the doorframe. Yet, to Lydia Barrett, everything had fallen into a silence so deep it pressed against her ribs. Only a few weeks had passed since she had lost her 3-year-old daughter, Tanya, to leukemia. But time had stopped the moment the monitors in the pediatric ward went still. Most mornings, Lydia sat on the floor of Tanya's room, wrapped in one of her daughter's small blankets, holding the stuffed pink bunny the little girl never slept without. She whispered to it gently, stroking the worn ears as if they were warm with life. Sometimes she imagined she could still feel Tanya's breath on her cheek, the way the child used to lean in to give her soft, messy kisses. Nothing in the apartment had been touched since the day they came home from the hospital. Lydia made sure of that. The room stayed exactly as it was, little shirts folded, dolls arranged, the crib untouched, because changing anything felt like erasing her child. Anthony Barrett stood in the doorway more often than not, watching her with a mixture of exhaustion and helplessness. He loved their daughter too. He had cried with her, prayed with her, held her through the final days. But where Lydia sank deeper into grief, Anthony tried to climb out of it. He wanted air, movement, something to break the suffocating stillness. "Lydia, we need to pack some of this up," he said one morning, his voice soft but tight. "We can donate her clothes, maybe give her toys to a shelter. We don't have to throw them away. Just put them somewhere safe." Lydia pressed the pink bunny harder against her chest, rocking slowly. "She'll need them," she whispered. "If she comes back, she'll need them." Anthony's expression collapsed. "Honey, she's not coming back." He crouched beside her, but she turned away, eyes locked on the empty crib as if waiting for Tanya to sit up and call her name. He tried again the next day, and the day after that. He opened a closet and gently touched the little dresses, but Lydia's hands slapped his away before he could lift even one hanger. She spoke to the dresses like they were fragile limbs of her daughter, promising she wouldn't let anyone disturb them. She clung to the bunny until her knuckles turned white. Finally, Anthony sat across from her at the kitchen table, shoulders heavy, voice stripped of warmth. "I can't live in a house of mourning, Lydia. I'm grieving too, but I can't keep pretending our daughter is still alive every minute of the day. This apartment feels like a tomb." She didn't look at him. She stared at her cold coffee as if it were another object from the past she had to protect. "Then go," she murmured. "If life is too heavy here, go." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead. He only let out a breath, a long, defeated exhale, and nodded. Their marriage had cracked the moment Tanya died. Now it simply broke apart. Within a month, Anthony moved out. He packed quietly, avoiding Tanya's room entirely. Lydia didn't watch him go. She closed the door and sat with the pink bunny in her lap until the hallway fell silent again. The divorce moved fast. Minnesota's no-fault laws made it straightforward, and there were no surviving children to consider, no long list of assets to divide. The apartment sold quickly, a sunny 2-bedroom in a good part of Minneapolis, and Lydia accepted her share of the proceeds without emotion. Money no longer meant anything. Time didn't either. What she wanted was distance. Somewhere without neighbors, without pitying eyes, without the constant ghost of her daughters, laughter hanging in every corner of every room. So she packed Tanya's belongings with trembling hands. Every dress, every shoe, every toy, every memory, and left the city behind. Within hours, she was driving north toward Little Birch Lake, where her parents' old cabin sat waiting, surrounded by pines and long winters, a place untouched by her daughter's life, a place where Lydia could disappear unnoticed. And that, she thought, was all she deserved now. A quiet place to wait, surrounded by snow, by silence, and by the memories she refused to let go. The cabin at Little Birch Lake looked exactly as Lydia remembered it from childhood visits. small, weathered, and framed by towering pines that creaked whenever the wind shifted. It had been her parents' retreat years ago, then left unused after they passed. Now it stood like a forgotten pocket of the world. Too remote for tourists and too quiet for families. For Lydia, that made it perfect. She carried in every box with meticulous care. Tanya's dresses were folded exactly as they had been in Minneapolis. Her toys were placed on shelves in the same arrangement, as if the child might walk in and reach for them. Even the tiny pink sneakers were set by the bedroom door, toes pointing outward, ready for a walk that would never come. The cabin filled quickly with remnants of a life cut short, and though the space was small, nothing felt crowded. Grief made room for everything. At first, the residents of Little Birch Lake treated her like any new neighbor. Kind, curious, well-meaning. A woman named Karen from 3 cabins down came by with a basket of baked muffins, wrapped in red cloth to keep them warm. "Just a little welcome," she said with a gentle smile. A retired couple stopped by the next day with homemade soup. Others left handwritten notes at her door. "If you need anything, just knock. So sorry for your loss. We're here to help." Lydia opened the door only far enough to take what was offered. She nodded once, maybe twice, then closed it before anyone could speak further. She didn't invite them in. She didn't say thank you. She didn't try to explain. Within a week, the visits dwindled. People at Little Birch Lake were used to folks with heartache. This was a small Minnesota town. After all, but they weren't used to walls built so high that not even a hello could get through. When Lydia walked past neighbors in the grocery store, she kept her head down, clutching a list with only the bare essentials. Bread, milk, tea, matches, oatmeal. When the cashier attempted a friendly, "How's your day going?" she didn't answer. She placed the money silently on the counter and left without waiting for change. Her appearance became familiar. Black coat, black boots, black scarf, black gloves. Always black, even in early autumn when others were still wearing light jackets. Her hair often hung unbrushed around her shoulders, as if touched only by sleep and sorrow. She never paused to chat, never waved, never lifted her eyes long enough for anyone to read them. And so the whispers began. "She's unstable," one neighbor murmured near the canned goods aisle. "No, just heartbroken beyond repair," another said, placing apples into a cart. A more dramatic voice near the post office declared, "She's creepy, but harmless. Keeps to herself. Doesn't talk to a soul." Yet, someone else added, "I heard she talks to toys." Someone saw her buying children's mittens, even though she doesn't have a kid. Rumors traveled fast in a small place like this. They twisted into more unsettling versions each time they passed from one porch to another. A few people even speculated that her grief made her dangerous, though none could explain in what way. It was the sort of fear created not by facts but by absence. No one knew her, so they filled in the blanks. Still, Lydia remained untouched by it all. She didn't read the glances or hear the murmurs. When she walked through the tiny market in town, conversations dipped to a hush around her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the floor, buying only what was necessary to survive. If someone stepped aside to give her room, she didn't notice. If a child stared curiously at her dark clothing, she kept moving. Her world had shrunk long before she arrived at Little Birch Lake, and she carried that world with her everywhere she went. It consisted of Tanya's memory, her voice, her laugh, the smell of her hair after a bath, the tiny socks she used to lose in the laundry. The cabin was simply a container for all of it. Outside, the townspeople watched from a distance, wondering who she had been before sorrow hardened her edges. Inside, Lydia barely remembered that a world existed beyond the cabin walls. To her, life had narrowed to a single point, the daughter she had lost and the pieces of her she refused to release. Everything else was silence. Time dissolved for Lydia in ways she could neither describe nor fight. Days passed without shape. Months came and went without announcement. The cabin sat at the edge of Little Birch Lake, surrounded by pines that shifted with every season, but to Lydia those changes meant nothing. Winter storms rolled across the lake with sheets of ice. Spring melt carved new paths through the woods, and autumn spilled red and gold leaves across the ground. Yet she saw none of it. The seasons behaved like they always had, but grief had removed her from their rhythm. She lived in a world where winter never ended, no matter how warm the air became. Most mornings began the same way. After boiling water for tea she rarely drank, Lydia walked into the small bedroom she had filled with Tanya's belongings. The nursery was untouched, preserved like a photograph made of wood and fabric and memory. The crib sat against the wall, still dressed in soft pink bedding. Tanya's dresses hung neatly in the closet, their tiny sleeves motionless. Sunlight sometimes filtered through the curtains, landing on the stuffed animals arranged along the shelf. The room looked ready for a child's laughter, for small footsteps running across the floor, but only silence lived there now. Lydia would sit on the edge of the rug, legs folded beneath her, the pink stuffed bunny cradled in her hands. She ran her fingers along its worn ears, the ones Tanya loved to chew on when she was teething. In those moments, her memories of her daughter rose up so vividly she could almost see Tanya toddling toward her, almost hear her small, uncertain voice saying "Mama," almost feel the weight of her in her arms. She remembered everything, the first steps that ended with giggles, the first tiny sneakers that never stayed tied, the first bowl of mashed peaches Tanya smeared across her own cheeks. The memories were so precise, so alive, that they felt like a second world layered over the one she inhabited. It was the only world she wanted to live in. Her grief slowly transformed into ritual. She touched the same dresses. She whispered the same stories. She held the same bunny. She breathed in the faint scent of the nursery closet every evening, hoping it still held a trace of her child's skin or the lavender soap she used to bathe her with. These rituals didn't heal her. They only kept her from collapsing into the dark void that waited everywhere else. And yet the void still called. She thought of ending her life more often than she ever admitted, even to herself. It was not out of dramatic despair or sudden impulse, but a quiet, constant pull, like an undertow beneath still water. There were nights she imagined walking out into the cold and letting the snow cover her until she no longer felt anything. There were mornings she stood by the lake, picturing the ice drifting open beneath her feet. But fear always stopped her. Not fear of pain, not fear of death, fear of losing Tanya again. She believed that if she took her own life, she might be denied the chance to see her daughter in the afterlife. The thought terrified her more than anything else. So she kept breathing, not for herself, not for the cabin, not for the world she no longer belonged to, but for the fragile promise that someday, somewhere, she might hold Tanya again. Her existence narrowed to that single thread of hope. She did not live for joy. She lived to avoid losing the only thing left to her. Survival was not a choice. It was a reluctant duty. As late autumn crept toward winter once more, Lydia barely noticed. The trees shed their leaves in swirling patterns she didn't look at. The lake hardened slowly under a skin of ice she never checked. The wind grew colder, sharper, but she wrapped herself in her grief instead of sweaters. Only when the sky turned an unnatural shade of gray did she finally lift her eyes. Clouds piled high above the treetops, heavy and swirling. The unmistakable warning of a Minnesota blizzard. The storm approached quickly, pushing a low rumble across the lake. Inside the cabin, Lydia sat on the nursery floor, holding the pink bunny against her chest, sinking deeper into a numbness, so thick it felt like part of her body. The storm outside raged closer, but she didn't move. She didn't notice. She didn't care. Her world had already gone cold. The blizzard arrived with a violence that felt almost personal. as if the sky itself had fractured and was spilling its fury over Little Birch Lake. Snowflakes struck the cabin windows in frantic bursts, each gust of wind howling with a low, mournful sound that rattled the eaves. Lydia Barrett sat in her usual place by the window, a dim lamp casting soft light over her face. She held Tanya's pink stuffed bunny in her lap, stroking its ears while whispering to her daughter's memory. Her voice was barely more than breath. "If you were here tonight, sweet girl, I'd wrap you in your warmest blanket. You always hated the cold." She smiled faintly, a fragile curve of her mouth that vanished almost instantly. The storm outside swirled in thick, white sheets, erasing the trees, the road, even the lake from view. It was the kind of night no one should be out in, no one except ghosts and maybe grief itself. For a moment, Lydia closed her eyes. When she opened them again, she saw a shape in the snow, a small figure standing only 30 feet from the cabin, barely visible through the storm's chaos. A child, a little girl. She stood completely still, snow piling on her shoulders and hair, staring straight at the window. Lydia froze. Her heart slammed once against her ribs, then seemed to stop. This had to be a vision, grief finally breaking her mind. She blinked hard, waiting for the image to dissolve, to melt back into the storm like a memory. But the girl didn't disappear. She remained exactly where she was, wide-eyed, shivering, very real. The shock snapped Lydia upright. The blanket fell from her lap as she grabbed her coat and flung open the door. The wind tore it from her hand, slamming into her face like a wall of ice, but she pushed forward anyway. Snow clawed at her legs as she trudged toward the child. When she reached the girl, she knelt down and wrapped her arms around the tiny, frozen body. "It's okay. I've got you," she said, the words rising instinctively, the way they once did for Tanya. The girl didn't resist. She couldn't. Her limbs were stiff with cold. Lydia scooped her up and forced her way back to the cabin. Inside, she set the child on the couch near the fireplace and quickly lit the logs. The flames crackled to life, warm and bright against the girl's trembling form. "What's your name?" Lydia asked gently as she removed the child's soaked mittens. "Milana," the girl whispered through chattering teeth. "Milana. Hayes." Lydia wrapped her in a thick blanket. "Where's your mom or dad, sweetheart? What happened?" Milana swallowed hard. "Our car crashed. My dad's still there. He wasn't waking up. I didn't know what to do." The words hit Lydia like a jolt of electricity. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her old first aid kit, the same one she hadn't touched since leaving Minneapolis, and pulled her hood over her head. "Stay here. Stay by the fire. Don't move," she instructed. The girl nodded, eyes wide with fear. Lydia stepped into the blizzard again, this time with urgency fueling her steps. The storm clawed at her face, and the wind nearly pushed her off balance. But she pressed on, following the faint indentation of footsteps leading away from the cabin. After several minutes, she spotted the shape of a vehicle, its front end buried in a drift, headlights faint beneath a crust of ice. She reached the SUV and pulled open the driver's door with effort. Inside, a man slumped over the steering wheel, airbag deployed, blood trailing from a cut along his temple. He was breathing, but shallowly unconscious. "Sir, can you hear me?" Lydia called out, tapping his shoulder. No response. Her nursing instincts, rusty but intact, took over. She checked his airway, lifted his chin, and ensured his breathing wasn't obstructed. Then she assessed him for major injuries. The airbag impact had likely caused the brief loss of consciousness. "Roman!" the man murmured faintly when she called to him again. "Roman! Hayes!" "I'm going to get you out," Lydia said firmly. She helped him out of the seat, supporting his weight as he stumbled against her. The storm made every step a battle, but she dragged him slowly, inch by inch, back toward the cabin. By the time they reached the porch, The snow had nearly swallowed their tracks behind them. Inside, Milana ran forward. "Daddy!" Roman blinked at her voice, disoriented but conscious now. Lydia lowered him to the couch. As he looked around at the toys, the pink dresses, the tiny shoes neatly arranged, something unreadable flickered in his expression. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The depth of grief in this home was unmistakable, and it wrapped around him as tangibly as the warmth of the fire. The cabin, once silent and cold, now held the uneven warmth of two strangers trying to recover from the storm. Snow battered the windows in relentless waves, but inside, the fireplace glowed steady and soft. Milana Hayes curled near it, wrapped in one of Lydia's heavy wool blankets. Her cheeks, earlier drained of color, were now flushed pink with returning warmth. Lydia moved through the small kitchen with a quiet purpose she hadn't felt in years. She heated a pot of chicken and vegetable soup she'd stored away for emergencies, set water to boil for tea, and placed thick slices of bread on a plate. The motions felt foreign, as if she were performing the movements of someone she used to be. Someone who cooked for a little girl with bright eyes and messy curls. When she carried the soup to Milana and Roman, she noticed the girl holding it carefully with both hands, blowing on the steam like she had done it 100 times. Roman murmured a grateful thank you as he took his bowl. "You're very kind," he said softly, one hand pressing against the bandage Lydia had placed on his temple. "I'm sorry for intruding like this. We didn't mean to." "You didn't intrude," Lydia replied. "You were freezing in the storm. If you'd stayed out there, neither of you would have survived the night." Her tone held no emotion, but the truth of her words hung heavily between them. Milana finished half her soup before her curiosity tugged her toward something behind Lydia. The girl slipped off the couch, blanket trailing behind her like a tiny cape, and wandered toward the shelf filled with children's toys. Lydia froze. The shelf had been untouched since she moved in. A row of plush animals, miniature wooden blocks, a small tea set, everything preserved exactly as it once belonged to Tanya. And there, nestled in the corner, lay the pink stuffed bunny. Milana reached out, smiling softly, and lifted the bunny by its ears. A sharp, immediate pain struck Lydia in the chest, so sudden she had to steady herself against the back of a chair. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. Her breath snagged. That toy, those ears, that faded fabric, had lived in her daughter's hands from infancy until the very last day. Roman noticed her stillness. "If it bothers you, I'll ask her to put it back." "I'm sorry." Lydia forced herself to shake her head. "No, she's just a child. Let her hold it." The words tasted like splinters. "It's fine." Milana hugged the bunny to her chest with innocent affection and giggled when she found a tiny button sewn into its paw. The sound, light, unburdened, unafraid, skimmed across the room like a small spark of warmth. It was the kind of laughter Lydia had not heard in more than a year, the kind that once filled her days without effort. For a fleeting moment, something inside her loosened. Not healed, not mended, but softened, like a thin crack forming in ice after months of deep freeze. She watched as Milana lined up wooden blocks on the rug, arranging them crookedly, humming a childish tune. She touched every toy with reverence, as if she knew they belonged to someone special. The cabin, always coated in grief, shifted ever so slightly, light making its way into corners that had stayed dark for too long. Roman set his empty bowl aside. "Thank you," he said again, more firmly this time, "for everything. I don't know what we would have done." Lydia exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't attempt to leave. The roads are closed, and visibility is almost zero. Stay here for the night, both of you. It's too dangerous to go anywhere." He nodded, exhaustion pulling at the lines of his face. "If you're sure." "I am." She gathered blankets from the closet, the same ones her parents had used in this cabin years ago. and laid them out on the living room floor, creating 2 makeshift beds near the fireplace. She tucked Milana in carefully, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The little girl smiled sleepily and kept the pink bunny in her arms. When everything was settled, Lydia retreated to her own small bedroom. She closed the door without locking it, out of instinct more than caution. The storm's howling was muffled through the walls, but inside her chest, emotions churned louder than the wind. She lay on her bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, feeling her heartbeat thud in a way it hadn't in years. Fast, uneven, alive. The presence of another child in her home, the laughter, the warmth, the fragile sense of purpose returning to her hands, it all unsettled her. Sleep never came. She lay awake through the night, haunted not by sorrow this time, but by something new, something she barely recognized, something dangerously close to feeling again. Morning came gently, slipping into the cabin through thin curtains as if unsure it was welcome. The storm had passed, leaving behind a deep hush that settled over the pines and the frozen lake. A soft glow touched the wooden walls, and for the first time in a long while, the light didn't feel harsh to Lydia Barrett. It felt almost warm. She stood barefoot in the kitchen, the floorboards cool beneath her feet, mixing batter in a ceramic bowl. The rhythmic motion soothed her in ways she hadn't expected. She hadn't made pancakes since Tanya's illness had taken over their lives, and she certainly hadn't cooked them for anyone else. Yet here she was, moving with the quiet precision of a mother preparing breakfast for a child. The cabin slowly filled with the sweet smell of browning batter, melting butter, and the faint, fruity aroma of strawberry jam. She hesitated when she opened the jar. She had made it months ago, in late summer, during a moment she couldn't explain. At the time, she had stirred the fruit mixture absent-mindedly, not knowing why she made something no one would eat. Now she finally understood. Milana woke to the scent before anything else. Still wrapped in her blanket, she sat up with a sleepy smile and wandered toward the kitchen. "Are those pancakes?" she asked, voice raspy from sleep. Lydia nodded and set a small plate on the table. "They're ready. Sit down." Milana climbed onto the chair and reached eagerly. Lydia handed her a spoonful of the jam. "Try it. I made it a while ago." The girl tasted it and her eyes brightened instantly. "This is really good. Why didn't you eat it?" Lydia didn't answer. She only watched the girl savor every bite, her small feet swinging beneath the chair, the pink bunny tucked securely at her side. Roman joined them soon after, moving carefully, still stiff from the accident. He looked around the kitchen with quiet appreciation. "It smells incredible," he said. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble." "It wasn't trouble," Lydia replied, and to her own surprise it was true. After breakfast, she suggested they step outside for some fresh air. The storm had transformed the world into a glittering landscape. Snowbanks sculpted by wind, icicles hanging from the porch roof like glass ornaments, and the sun reflecting off everything in dazzling flashes. Lydia paused on the threshold, blinking against the brightness. For years, sunlight had been nothing but an irritating reminder that life continued without her daughter. But now it was different. The light landed on her face, warm and sharp, and she breathed in deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs. Her lips curved into a faint, stunned smile. Roman noticed. Milana noticed too. Neither said a word. But the moment felt like a fragile leaf unfurling, something that might tear if touched, yet still undeniably alive. "Do you have sleds?" Milana asked suddenly, pointing toward the shed beside the cabin. Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Two. They belong to my parents. They should still be in there." Minutes later, all three were trudging up a small hill behind the cabin, each dragging a dusty sled pulled from the shed. The snow crunched beneath their boots, sunlight bouncing off it like scattered diamonds. Milana plopped onto her sled first, gripping the handles, her breath puffing out in excited bursts. "You ready?" Roman asked her. She nodded enthusiastically, and then she was off, shrieking with laughter as she sped down the slope. Lydia watched her, stunned by how easily joy seemed to find the child. She wasn't sure she remembered what laughter sounded like on her own lips, but when Roman sat beside her on a sled and nudged her gently with a shoulder, she found herself accepting the silent invitation. They pushed off together. Cold air whipped around her face, and snow sprayed out behind them. The world zoomed past in a blur of white and light blue. For a few seconds, just a few seconds, Lydia felt weightless. When the sled skidded to a stop at the bottom of the hill, something unexpected burst from her chest. A laugh. It was small, breathy, and surprised, but it was hers. Roman turned to look at her, eyes soft. "It's good to hear that," he said. Embarrassed, she shook her head. "I haven't," the words faded. She didn't need to finish. Roman looked down at the snow, his smile fading into something more solemn. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said quietly. "A car crash. Milana was only 2. We've been trying to find our way ever since." The words settled heavily between them, not as a burden, but as recognition. 2 broken hearts reflecting each other's wounds. Before Lydia could respond, Roman gestured toward the SUV half buried beyond the trees. "That storm did a number on my car. The front axles, probably gone. Once the road's open, I'll have to call a tow truck." Lydia nodded, feeling a mix of relief and something else she didn't dare name. For now, he and Milana weren't going anywhere. And for the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The next morning, the world outside seemed gentler, as if the storm had swept away more than snow. The air was crisp, the sky an unnaturally sharp blue, and sunlight glittered across the frozen lake in long streaks of silver. When Lydia stepped out of the cabin with Roman and Milana, her breath formed soft clouds in the cold, but for once, she felt something close to warmth inside her chest. They made their way toward town, following the narrow road that wound past a row of cabins and into the small commercial stretch of Little Birch Lake. The walk wasn't long, but it was enough for Lydia to become conscious of how different she must look. Her cheeks were flushed from the winter air, and her eyes, usually clouded with a heavy, faraway sadness, seemed clearer, focused on the present moment instead of the past. When she entered the grocery store with Roman and Milana, conversations dipped. People glanced over their shoulders, surprised to see her not alone, not wrapped entirely in black silence. She didn't hide behind her hood this time. She walked with a steady, grounded pace, the child skipping between her and Roman. "She looks different," someone whispered near the produce section. "Is that really her?" another murmured by the bakery counter. But the comment that floated most clearly across the aisle came from an older woman arranging cans onto a shelf. "She's coming back to life." Lydia didn't acknowledge any of it. She focused instead on the cart, the shelves, the small tug of Milana's hand when she asked if they could buy cocoa mix. Roman watched her quietly, sensing the shift even if she didn't name it. They moved through the aisles efficiently, stocking up for a few days: bread, eggs, butter, fresh vegetables, oats, the cocoa mix Milana wanted. When they reached the checkout line, the cashier greeted them with a warm smile, and this time Lydia managed a polite nod. It was small, but remarkable. When they returned to the cabin, the afternoon light had turned soft, the first hints of evening stretching across the snow. Milana went to play by the fireplace, arranging wooden blocks and humming to herself. Roman carried the groceries into the kitchen, placing each bag on the counter. Lydia stood at the doorway to the living room, hands clasped in front of her, and for the first time in a long while, she spoke about something she had kept locked away. "Tanya's birth was complicated," she said quietly. Her voice didn't waver. It simply carried the weight of truth. "The doctors told me afterward I wouldn't be able to have another child. Too much damage. Too many risks. Roman paused, looking up at her slowly. His expression was neither pitying nor shocked, just open, steady, absorbing her words without crowding them. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "It was fine when she was here," Lydia continued. "I didn't care. Tanya was all I needed." She swallowed. "And after everything, I just stopped thinking about the future. Stopped thinking about anything at all. I couldn't imagine a life where another breath mattered." Roman didn't move closer. He didn't reach for her hand. He simply listened, which somehow felt like more than anything he could have done. When she finished speaking, Lydia felt a strange lightness, as if she had opened a window in a house long sealed shut. She excused herself quietly and went into her bedroom. On the top shelf of the closet sat a small floral cosmetic bag she hadn't touched in years. Dust clung to its zipper. She hesitated, then pulled it down. Inside were items she once used without thought: a worn hairbrush, a tube of lip balm, a small compact of powder, a faded bottle of perfume she remembered wearing to work at the Minneapolis clinic. She hadn't cared about any of this since Tanya's illness had consumed her life. She'd stopped looking in mirrors, stopped fixing her hair, stopped believing she had a place in the world where such things mattered. But now, holding the old cosmetic bag in her hands, she felt something shift. Not transformation, just the faintest spark of self-recognition. A reminder that she had once been a woman who laughed, who worked, who lived among others instead of hiding from them. She set the bag on her dresser and sat down beside it. There, in the quiet of her room, she considered something she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years: returning to work. The small clinic in town always needed an extra pair of hands during winter. She still had her credentials. Even if they were out of practice, it would be difficult. It would be terrifying, but it would also be a step toward something bigger than grief, a step back into the world she had abandoned. By the next morning, the storm had fully surrendered to calm. The sky stretched wide and pale above Little Birch Lake, and the snow on the road, plowed at last, glittered like crushed glass under the sun. The fresh stillness was almost jarring after the chaos of the blizzard. With the roads finally open, a tow truck rumbled into view around noon, its engine echoing through the trees as it pulled up beside the buried SUV. Roman stepped outside to speak with the driver while Lydia stood on the porch, arms folded tightly against her chest. Milana fetched her pink bunny before joining her father, hopping through the snow with childlike excitement, unaware of the ache forming slowly in Lydia's chest. Inside the cabin, Roman and Milana began packing the few belongings they had used during their short stay. Roman folded blankets, apologized again for the inconvenience, and checked his phone for messages now that cell service had returned. Milana gathered the toys she had touched, though she paused for a long moment at the shelves, as if uncertain whether she should put the bunny back. Lydia kept her expression neutral, hiding the tightening in her throat. "Keep it," she said softly, surprising herself. "It's all right." Milana smiled, so brightly it almost hurt to look at her. When everything was ready, Roman zipped their duffel bag and glanced around the cabin. "Thank you," he said, meeting Lydia's eyes, "for saving us, for giving us a place to stay. I don't know how to express how grateful I am." "You don't need to," she replied, her voice steady despite the pressure in her chest. "I'm glad you were here." It was the truth. Their presence had pushed light through cracks she didn't know were still there. Milana ran to her and wrapped her small arms around Lydia's waist with surprising force. "Can we come back?" she asked, muffled by Lydia's coat. "Please? I want to see you again." Lydia placed a hand gently on the girl's hair. "Of course," she whispered. "Any time." Roman stood quietly behind them, watching the moment with softened eyes. When they stepped toward the door, Lydia walked with them, gripping the edge of the frame to steady herself. Milana waved, cheeks rosy, bundled in a scarf too big for her small shoulders. Roman gave Lydia a final nod, one that carried more sincerity than words could hold. Then the door closed. The sound was soft, but it echoed through the cabin like a distant crack of ice. Lydia stood for several seconds without moving, her hand still resting on the door, as if holding it open in memory alone. When she finally stepped back, the silence settled around her. Familiar, yes, but strangely altered. The house was painfully empty, but not in the way it had been before. Not dark, not dead, just quietly waiting, as though someone had opened a window and allowed a sliver of air, of possibility, to drift inside. She moved through the cabin slowly, noticing things she hadn't paid attention to in years. The shine of sunlight on the floorboards, the faint scent of pancakes from the morning before, the warmth still lingering near the fireplace. The absence felt sharp, but it wasn't hollow despair. It was something gentler, something she needed to sit with. Needing air, she slipped on her coat and stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she walked along the road toward town. The air was crisp and clean, biting against her cheeks in a way that made her feel awake. When she reached the small grocery store, a couple of neighbors waved. The man who ran the bait shop greeted her with a cheerful afternoon. Lydia, a woman walking her dog, paused to ask if she was doing all right after the storm. People had greeted her before, but she had never really seen them. Now, for reasons she didn't fully understand, she returned the greetings with quiet nods and a small, careful smile. It was enough. By the time she walked back toward the cabin, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow. She opened the door, stepped inside, and breathed in the familiar scent of pine and faint smoke. For the first time since Tanya's death, she didn't feel like a ghost drifting through the world. She felt, however fragile, however uncertain, alive. New Year's Eve arrived quietly at Little Birch Lake, without fanfare or excitement, just a pale winter sky and a coldness that seeped slowly into the cabin walls. Lydia Barrett had no intention of acknowledging the holiday. She moved through the house with deliberate numbness, drawing the curtains halfway and turning off every unnecessary light. Celebrations belonged to another life, another world, a world where Tanya still existed, where Anthony had once held her hand as the clock struck midnight. Now, the very idea of the holiday felt like a distant echo. She planned to drink her tea, curl beneath a blanket, and fall asleep long before midnight. No countdown, no music, no memories she wasn't ready to face. She brewed her tea and sat by the window, the pink stuffed bunny resting in its usual place beside her armchair. Outside, snow had begun falling again, not the violent, chaotic kind that had nearly swallowed Roman and Milana, but soft, slow flakes drifting down like scattered feathers. They coated the porch, the pine branches, the old sled tracks still faintly visible in the yard. As the steam rose from her mug, her thoughts drifted. She pictured Anthony's new life in Minneapolis, imagined him celebrating with friends or family, raising a glass to the new year. She wondered if he ever thought of her anymore, of the life they almost had, the child they both lost, the marriage that hadn't survived the weight of grief. Perhaps he was happier now. Perhaps he had found someone who wasn't shaped by sorrow. Good for him, she whispered, though the words felt thin. What meaning could holidays possibly hold when the person who brought joy to them was gone? New Year's Eve, Christmas, birthdays, they had all become reminders of an empty space at the table, a voice that would never ring through the rooms. She lifted her mug for another sip, then froze. Two figures were moving through the storm. At first, she blinked hard, convinced the blizzard's memory was playing tricks on her again. But as the shapes grew clearer, one tall and steady, the other small and bounding forward through the snow, her heart leapt into her throat. It was Roman and Milana. They were back. Lydia stood abruptly, the mug trembling in her hands. She pressed her palm to the window as if needing to confirm they were real. The closer they came, the more her chest tightened, not with fear, not with confusion, but with an overwhelming surge of emotion she hadn't prepared for. Her eyes burned, and she drew a shaky breath. When she opened the door, the cold rushed in, but she barely felt it. Milana sprinted toward her with outstretched arms. "We came back for New Year's Eve," she shouted, cheeks bright red from the cold. Roman followed with an apologetic smile. "I hope we're not intruding." Lydia shook her head, unable to find her voice for a moment. I'm glad you're here." They stepped inside, stamping snow from their boots. Roman carried 2 large bags filled with food, lights, and decorations they'd picked up from town. The energy they brought with them was immediate, warm, familiar, comforting in a way the cabin hadn't felt in years. "We thought this place needed some holiday magic," Roman said gently. Milana began pulling items from the bags. Strings of lights, a small box of ornaments, a tin of cookies, a bundle of cinnamon sticks for the stove. Lydia watched her move with excitement, the pink bunny tucked snugly under her arm. Together, the 3 of them stepped outside again and added lights to the tall pine tree near the porch. Roman climbed a small ladder to secure the highest string while Milana handed ornaments to Lydia, who placed them carefully on the branches. The soft glow of the lights reflected across the snow, casting warm circles on the ground. "It's beautiful," Lydia murmured, surprised by the sincerity in her own voice. Inside, they set the table with simple holiday food: roasted chicken, bread, apples, cocoa, and cookies. The cabin, which had always seemed too quiet, now hummed with energy. Laughter echoed against the wooden walls. Milana danced between the rooms with her bunny, humming a tune that had no name. At one point, she looked up from her plate and said with absolute confidence, "Santa will definitely come to this house." Roman chuckled softly, and Lydia felt a sudden ache in her throat, the kind that came not from sorrow, but from warmth she wasn't used to anymore. When the clock neared 9, Milana's eyelids drooped. Roman carried her to the couch by the fireplace, tucking a blanket around her as she fell asleep clutching the pink bunny. The cabin quieted again, but not with emptiness. Lydia sat beside the fire, her hands folded in her lap. Roman joined her, sitting close but not too close. They spoke in low voices about the year behind them, about grief, about the pain of trying to rebuild a life that felt permanently fractured. Roman looked at the fire instead of at her as he spoke. "I didn't know if I'd ever feel anything like hope again," he said quietly. Lydia turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither." The flames flickered between them, reflecting in both their eyes. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It felt full, warm, fragile in a way that spoke of something beginning rather than something ending. Hope, faint but unmistakable, bloomed softly in the space between them. The first morning of the new year arrived softly, with pale sunlight stretching across the cabin floorboards. Milana stirred awake on the couch, rubbing her eyes and blinking at the faint glow of the fire. When she noticed the small pile of presents arranged neatly beside her, placed there by Roman while she slept, her entire face lit up. "Santa came," she squealed, scooping up the wrapped boxes with both arms. Roman and Lydia watched from the doorway as the little girl tore through ribbons and paper, marveling at each gift: a knitted scarf, a small wooden puzzle, a new pair of mittens, and a tiny music box that played a lullaby when she turned the handle. Milana held it against her chest, swaying happily as the melody filled the room. Lydia felt a warmth spread through her chest, unexpected, tender, and bittersweet. She wasn't Milana's mother, not officially, not by blood. But when the child looked at her with sparkling eyes, when she giggled and ran over to show her each new treasure, something inside Lydia softened further. Something long dormant rose quietly to the surface. It felt like being called Mom, even if no one said the word aloud. The 2 weeks that followed carried a kind of joy Lydia hadn't known in years. The world outside was frozen in layers of white, but inside the cabin, and in her heart, something began to thaw. They went sledding down the hill behind the cabin every afternoon, laughing as they tumbled into snowbanks. They cooked warm meals together, pancakes, soups, roasted vegetables, moving around each other in the small kitchen with a natural rhythm, as if this domestic dance had always existed. Milana taught Lydia how to build a snow fort using 2 plastic bins and a small shovel. Roman gathered branches for the fireplace, while Milana and Lydia decorated the fort with pine cones and icicles. At night, they drank cocoa and played simple card games. Slowly, gently, days slipped into one another, creating a life that felt whole in a way Lydia had believed impossible. Yet, as the day of Roman's departure approached, a shadow settled back into her thoughts. She found herself waking early, standing at the window, watching the road where the tow truck would eventually arrive. The fear crept in quietly, chilling her more than any winter night. The fear of returning to silence, to empty rooms, to a world without laughter or small footsteps. She didn't tell Roman. She didn't tell anyone. She carried it alone, the way she had carried everything since Tanya died. On the morning they were meant to leave, Roman stepped outside to check the weather and speak with the driver who was scheduled to meet them later in the afternoon. When he returned, he found Lydia in the living room, folding one of the blankets they had used, her movements slow and unfocused. "Hey," he said softly. She looked up, forcing a smile. "Are you ready?" Instead of answering, Roman walked toward her. He reached for her hand, something he hadn't done before, and she felt a shock of warmth travel up her arm. His fingers closed gently around hers. "Lydia," he said, voice quiet but steady, "there's something I need to ask you before we go." She blinked, startled, and looked at him fully for the first time. His expression was calm, but behind it lived something earnest, vulnerable. Roman reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Her breath caught. He opened it to reveal a simple silver ring. "I don't want to leave you here," he said, "and I don't want to build a life without you in it. Lydia, will you marry me?" The room seemed to shrink and expand all at once. Her knees weakened. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, quiet, fragile tears, not of sorrow, but of something she had forgotten how to feel, hope. Roman continued gently, "Come with us. Come to the city. We can make a home there, together with Milana, as a family." Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. For a moment, she couldn't speak. All the losses, all the darkness she had lived through, all the years of numbness, they stood behind her like a long shadow. But before her was a light she had never expected. Finally she nodded, quietly, slowly, but surely. "Yes," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Yes, I will." Roman exhaled in relief and placed the ring on her finger with steady hands. Before packing to leave, Lydia walked quietly into Tanya's old room. She looked around at the toys, the dresses, the crib she had kept untouched for so long. Her gaze lingered on each item with love, but without the piercing grief that once made them unbearable. She reached for only one object, Tanya's pink bunny. She held it gently, pressing it to her heart. Everything else, every dress, every shoe, every trace of the past she left behind. Her dark clothes, too, remained folded in the bedroom closet. She wore a soft cream sweater instead, one she had never found the courage to take out before. When the 3 of them stepped outside, holding hands, the winter sun shone on the snow, bright and welcoming. Together, they returned to the city, Lydia stepping into a new life she had once believed she no longer deserved. Months passed. Spring softened the air. Birds returned to the lake. And on March 8th, while Roman cooked dinner and Lydia read on the couch, Milana climbed into her lap, rested her head against her chest, and said softly, "Mom." The word broke something open inside her, something tender and luminous. She held the child close, tears rising again, not from pain but from pure, overwhelming love. In that moment, Lydia understood with certainty. She had stepped fully into the light. And Tanya, wherever she was, would not be angry